How long will you allow a handful of owners to command the fate of millions? How long will you mistake the chains that bind you for the natural order of the world? This question is not asked to startle you, it is asked to awaken you. For society, as it stands today, is built upon a deception so vast that it forces the worker to see isolation where only unity can create liberation. From the moment labor became the engine of production, humanity was divided into those who create and those who appropriate. Yet the worker, standing alone, sees only his individual struggle, his empty pockets, his long hours, his exhaustion, and believes it to be a personal failure rather than the calculated result of a system designed to fragment him. Capital thrives not merely by exploiting labor, but by isolating the laborer, convincing him that he is powerless except through obedience. The ruling class understands something many workers do not. The individual is weak, but the collective is invincible. That is why the owners of capital unite in their associations, guilds, corporations, and alliances. They coordinate their prices, their markets, their strategies, and their political influence. They operate as one body with many hands, each hand extracting from the laborer more than it gives. Their unity is not accidental, it is the mechanism by which they preserve their domination. But the worker who builds the cities, harvests the fields, shapes the machines, illuminates the factories, and supplies the world with every necessity has been taught to stand alone. He is told that his neighbor is a competitor, his fellow laborer a threat, and his class a fiction. He is made to believe that struggle is individual, that success is personal, and that suffering is a sign of his inadequacy rather than the symptom of exploitation. This illusion is the most powerful tool of the capitalist order, for a divided working class is a conquered working class. To understand power, you must understand that every factory, every railway, every shipyard, every mine, every digital network, every towering edifice of modern industry exists not because of the capitalist's brilliance, but because of the coordinated labor of thousands. The laborer does not merely contribute to production, he is production. Yet because he is separated from his fellow workers, he cannot see the immense strength embedded in his collective existence. History has never moved forward through the will of isolated individuals, no matter how heroic they appear. It has advanced through the rising consciousness of classes, through workers recognizing their shared conditions, shared exploitation, and shared destiny. This is the foundation upon which revolutions are built. Society transforms not when one person resists, but when the masses stand together and declare that the old order has exhausted its legitimacy. Capital cannot be confronted by individual protest any more than a storm can be halted by a single hand. The system is vast, complex, and fortified by institutions created to defend it. Only the united force of those it exploits can challenge its power. The working class, scattered across factories, offices, fields, and digital platforms, must come to see that every grievance they endure is rooted in the same economic structure. Their wages differ, their tasks differ, their languages differ, but their exploitation is identical. And once they recognize this truth, the entire foundation of capitalism trembles. Do not mistake unity for mere sentiment. It is a material force, a revolutionary necessity, the only counterweight to accumulated capital. When workers organize, when they coordinate their demands, when they strike with one voice, production halts, profits vanish, and the illusion of capitalist supremacy dissolves. At that moment, the power dynamic becomes clear. The worker does not depend on the capitalist depends entirely on the worker. This is why the ruling class fears worker organization more than any crisis, any election, any competing corporation. They fear the moment when the worker stops seeing himself as an individual seller of labor and begins to see himself as part of a class whose shared interests transcend all divisions. They fear the awakening of consciousness, the realization that unity is not an option, it is the weapon that overturns the existing order. And so I tell you, no individual can fight alone. Not because individuals lack courage or will, but because the system they confront is not designed to be challenged by solitary resistance. It is designed to consume the isolated, to overwhelm them, to convince them that nothing can change. But everything can change the moment you refuse to stand alone. When you reach out to your fellow workers, when you align your struggle with theirs, when you organize, deliberate, and act together, you step into a power greater than that of any owner, any institution, any state. You step into the power of history itself. The time has come to reject the myth of solitary struggle. The time has come to recognize that your strength does not lie in individual endurance, but in collective action. The time has come to rise not as separate voices drowned in the noise of exploitation, but as a chorus that cannot be ignored. For unity is not merely strength, unity is power, and power in the hands of the working class is the beginning of a new world. The individual is weak, only the united working class can confront the power of capital. This truth is not a poetic exaggeration, but a concrete reality rooted in the structure of modern society. Capital, by its very nature, concentrates power into the hands of a minority whose authority rests not on personal brilliance, but on ownership of the means of production. Against this concentrated power, the isolated worker stands like a single drop of water against a roaring tide. He may struggle, protest, or endure, but as long as his resistance remains solitary, it cannot alter the foundations that keep him subordinate. The capitalist system is designed to atomize individuals, to make them believe that every hardship is a private burden, every failure a personal flaw, every injustice an isolated event detached from the larger machinery that produces it. This illusion protects capital far more effectively than any law or institution, for it convinces workers that their suffering is natural and unavoidable. The worker alone possesses nothing but his labor power, and this labor power becomes meaningful to the capitalist only when it can be purchased cheaply and controlled efficiently. If each worker approaches his struggle individually, he becomes easily replaceable, easily silenced, and easily manipulated. A single worker demanding fair wages risks losing his livelihood. A group of workers demanding the same becomes a force the capitalist must reckon with. This asymmetry explains why capital thrives on division, why it promotes competition among workers, why it emphasizes individual achievement over collective welfare, and why it praises personal responsibility while evading responsibility for systemic inequality. Division weakens, isolation disarms, and solitude breaks the spirit long before the body collapses. Yet the moment workers understand that their exploitation is shared, not private, their position begins to change. When they recognize that the misery of one is bound to the misery of many, that the pressures placed on them are rooted in the same economic logic, that their struggles are interconnected, they begin to see the outline of a new power, one that emerges not from the individual but from the collective. The unity of workers is not just the merging of voices, but the merging of material strength. It is the recognition that the capitalist can only rule because the worker is divided, and that once the worker stops standing alone, capital's authority is no longer secure. When workers unite, they transform their dispersed grievances into organized resistance, their isolated demands into collective pressure, and their individual vulnerabilities into shared courage. Capitalists understand this dynamic far better than many workers themselves. That is why employers organize in associations, lobby as unified blocs, coordinate across industries, and protect each other's interests with remarkable consistency. Their unity is not based on moral agreement or mutual affection, but on the understanding that their position depends on maintaining dominance over labor. They may compete in the marketplace, but they collaborate in preserving the structure that ensures their wealth. Meanwhile, workers are encouraged to see one another as competitors for wages, promotions, opportunities, and even basic survival. They are told that unity is naive, dangerous, or unnecessary, while the ruling class quietly practices unity every moment of its existence. This contradiction reveals the fundamental strategy of capital: unite at the top, divide at the bottom. The power of the working class emerges only when this strategy is exposed and rejected. When workers realize that their individual struggles are not isolated but systemic, they begin to understand that their liberation lies not in personal escape but in collective transformation. A worker who organizes is no longer merely an employee. He becomes part of a force that can negotiate, resist, and reshape the conditions imposed upon him. Unity allows workers to challenge not just specific injustices, but the very logic that produces those injustices. It gives them the leverage to halt production, to demand structural change, and to confront the economic powers that would otherwise dominate them without opposition. No capitalist enterprise, no matter how vast, can function without the coordinated labor of its workers. This dependence is the workers' greatest strength, but it is a strength that only becomes visible when workers act together. The individual alone has no power because the system has made sure he stands alone. But the moment workers unite, every illusion of capitalist invincibility begins to crumble. Their collective force does not emerge from any one person's will, but from the realization that solidarity transforms weakness into strength, fear into resolve, and scattered efforts into a force capable of confronting capital itself. Isolation is the ruling class's greatest weapon. Unity is the workers' greatest strength. This is not an abstract slogan, but the fundamental logic through which power is maintained in a society divided by class. The ruling class understands that the greatest danger to its dominance is not the anger of isolated individuals, but the awakening of collective consciousness among workers. An individual worker can be dismissed, ignored, punished, or replaced. A united working class cannot be so easily subdued. To prevent this unity, the ruling class cultivates isolation in countless subtle and overt ways, turning workers into separated atoms who fail to recognize their shared struggle. Isolation begins with the way labor is organized. Workers toil in different departments, on different shifts, in different sectors, rarely seeing the full picture of production or the shared nature of their exploitation. They experience fatigue, insecurity, and pressure, yet interpret these conditions as personal burdens rather than common symptoms of a system designed to extract maximum profit at the lowest cost. By keeping workers separated in experience, thought, and action, the ruling class ensures that each feels alone in his suffering, unable to connect his condition to the structure that produces it. This solitude makes resistance appear futile, as though one person's dissatisfaction has no significance against the vast machinery of capital. The ruling class reinforces this isolation by promoting competition among workers. They are told to compete for wages, for positions, for recognition, for survival itself. Every co-worker becomes a potential rival rather than an ally. In this manufactured rivalry, unity is made to seem impractical, even dangerous, as individuals fear that cooperation will weaken their personal advantage. But this competition is a mirage. Whatever one worker gains at the expense of another remains insignificant compared to what the ruling class gains from keeping them divided. By competing, workers strengthen the very system that exploits them. By uniting, they challenge it. This isolation extends beyond the workplace into the broader culture. The ideology of individualism is constantly repeated. Success is personal, failure is personal, hardship is personal. If you are struggling, it is your fault. If you are exhausted, you must work harder. If you are underpaid, you must prove your worth. Through this ideology, systemic injustice is disguised as individual deficiency. This is one of the ruling class's most effective weapons, for when workers internalize blame, they lose sight of the economic forces shaping their lives. They become isolated not only from one another, but from their own understanding of their exploitation. Yet this entire structure of isolation remains fragile, for it depends on workers not realizing that their experiences are shared. The moment workers recognize that their struggles are not personal failures, but reflections of a system built upon inequality, isolation begins to crumble. When workers see that their co-workers suffer the same injustices, face the same pressures, and endure the same insecurities, they begin to understand that unity is the only rational response. In unity, they discover not only the strength to resist, but the clarity to see their situation for what it truly is. Unity transforms the workers from isolated individuals into a collective force capable of confronting capital. This transformation is not merely psychological, it is material. When workers unite, they gain the ability to negotiate as equals, to disrupt production, to withhold their labor, and to impose demands that the ruling class cannot easily ignore. The power of capital depends entirely on the continuous labor of the working class. When that labor is withdrawn or coordinated, the ruling class is exposed as being utterly dependent on those it claims to command. Unity reveals the true balance of power in society, a balance the ruling class desperately seeks to conceal. This is why every historical movement toward worker organization has been met with resistance from the ruling class. They fear strikes, unions, assemblies, and any form of collective action because these threaten the very foundation of their authority. They know that a united working class possesses a strength far greater than anything capital can muster. It is not the wealth or intelligence of the ruling class that maintains their dominance, but the division of the workers. When that division dissolves, so too does their power. Isolation is therefore not an accident but a deliberate strategy, woven into the fabric of capitalist society. And unity is not a luxury but a necessity for the working class. It is the only means through which they can confront exploitation, challenge domination, and reclaim control over the conditions of their lives. The ruling class fears nothing more than workers recognizing their own strength. For once they do, the system that depends on their division can no longer stand. Every factory, every industry, every social structure exists because of collective labor, not capitalist genius. This truth lies buried beneath layers of ideology that elevate the capitalist as the visionary architect of progress while reducing the worker to a replaceable instrument. Yet when the veil is lifted, it becomes unmistakably clear that the capitalist produces nothing, builds nothing, and creates nothing. It is the hands, minds, and coordinated efforts of workers that give life to the material world. Without their labor, the machines remain idle. The buildings remain empty shells, the markets remain barren, and society itself ceases to function. Capitalist wealth is not the product of talent, but of ownership. It is the power to command the labor of others while contributing none of one's own. The myth of capitalist genius is necessary for the system to legitimize itself. Workers must be convinced that the capitalist deserves his position because of superior intelligence, innovation, or courage. They are told that factories rise through entrepreneurial brilliance, that industries flourish because of managerial acumen, and that economies grow through the risk-taking of a select few. But this narrative collapses the moment we examine the real mechanics of production. A factory is not a monument to one individual's ingenuity. It is the combined output of miners who extract the raw materials, machine operators who shape them, engineers who maintain the equipment, electricians who power the structure, custodians who keep it functioning, and countless other workers whose labor is indispensable. The capitalist does not and cannot execute these tasks. Yet he claims ownership over their results simply because he possesses the title to the means of production. The very concept of industry depends on cooperative labor. No single individual can assemble a car, build a skyscraper, design a railway network, or maintain a digital infrastructure. These accomplishments arise from the synchronized efforts of hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of workers whose contributions are interdependent. This interdependence reveals a fundamental truth. Production is a social process, not an individual achievement. The capitalist takes advantage of this collective power, appropriating the value created by workers while obscuring the fact that he adds none of his own. His role is not productive, it is supervisory and extractive. He organizes exploitation, not creation. Even inventions and technological advances, often attributed to capitalist initiative, are the result of collective human knowledge accumulated over generations. Every breakthrough depends on the discoveries of earlier scientists, the labor of countless researchers, and the support of workers who build, test, and implement new technologies. The capitalist claims credit for innovation simply because he finances it, yet financing is not creation. Money does not invent, think, or build. People do. The glorification of capitalist genius steals recognition from those whose labor makes innovation possible. Social structures themselves, schools, hospitals, transportation networks, communication systems, and public institutions function because of coordinated labor. Teachers, doctors, nurses, drivers, builders, cleaners, clerks, and technicians keep society operating day after day. These are not glamorous roles, nor are they elevated by the ideology of capitalism, but they are the foundation upon which everything stands. A capitalist may own a hospital or a transport company, but he cannot heal a patient or operate a train. The functioning of society depends on work, not wealth, and on cooperation, not competition. Capitalist ideology must conceal this reality because it exposes the absurdity of capitalist dominance. If workers create all value, why are they not the ones who control production? If industries depend on collective labor, why are the fruits of that labor appropriated by those who contribute nothing to its creation? The answer lies in the system of private property, which allows the capitalist to monopolize the tools, machines, land, and resources necessary for production. This monopoly forces workers into dependence, compelling them to sell their labor for wages that do not reflect the value they produce. The capitalist's power is not derived from genius, but from ownership backed by the authority of the state, the laws of property, and the ideology of individual achievement. Recognizing that collective labor is the true engine of society is the first step toward challenging the legitimacy of capitalist rule. Once workers understand that everything around them, the buildings they enter, the roads they travel, the technologies they use, the food they eat, the clothes they wear exists because of their own combined efforts, the illusion of capitalist superiority evaporates. They see that they are the creators of wealth, the builders of the world, the foundation upon which every industry rests. They see that the capitalist's wealth is nothing more than the accumulated product of their stolen labor. And when this understanding takes root, the demand for a new social order becomes not only possible but inevitable. History changes only when workers recognize their shared exploitation and rise together as a class. This is not a romantic claim or a dramatic flourish, but a conclusion drawn from every turning point in social development. Human society has never transformed because isolated individuals willed it so. It has changed only when the masses, whose labor sustains the entire system, arrived at a collective understanding of their position. Exploitation becomes visible not in the life of one worker, but in the patterns repeated across millions, in the identical struggles that appear in factory floors, offices, fields, and workshops. When workers see that these conditions are not accidents or personal misfortunes, but expressions of a structure designed to extract value from their labor, the possibility of historical movement emerges. As long as a worker views his hardships as unique, he searches for individual solutions. Longer hours, greater effort, obedience, sacrifice. He blames himself for the insufficiency of wages, the insecurity of employment, the exhaustion that consumes him. The ruling order reinforces this notion, teaching him that advancement comes from personal struggle, that failure is a private deficiency, and that dissatisfaction is a sign of weak character. This ideology is essential for maintaining the existing structure, for it converts systemic exploitation into isolated personal burdens. A worker consumed by self-blame cannot recognize the chains that bind him, nor can he see that countless others suffer the same conditions under the same economic pressures. But when workers compare their experiences, when they hear in each other's voices the same frustrations, the same injustices, the same exhaustion, a profound shift occurs. They begin to understand that exploitation is not personal but collective. They recognize that the pressures they face are imposed by the logic of capital, and that their suffering is part of a larger mechanism that depends on extracting surplus from their labor while denying them control over the conditions of their work. This shared recognition is the beginning of class consciousness, the moment when workers stop seeing themselves as isolated individuals and begin to see themselves as members of a class with common interests. Class consciousness is not merely an awareness of exploitation, it is an understanding that the power to change society lies in collective action. When workers identify their shared conditions, they also discover their shared strength. No economic system can function without their labor. Every factory that hums with production, every office that coordinates activity, every infrastructure that sustains daily life exists because of the efforts of those who work, not those who own. This realization exposes the true balance of power in society and reveals that the structures of domination persist only because workers have not yet acted together to challenge them. Historical change does not arise from spontaneous anger but from organized understanding. When workers recognize their common exploitation, they start forming associations, unions, councils, and movements. They begin to articulate their demands collectively, transforming isolated grievances into organized pressure. Through this organization, they gain the ability to negotiate, resist, and ultimately reshape the conditions imposed upon them. Even the smallest act of unity, shared discussion, collective refusal, coordinated demands becomes a threat to systems built on division. Ruling classes throughout history have understood this and have often responded with suppression, precisely because they know that once workers begin to act as a class, the stability of the entire order is shaken. The history of revolutions, reforms, and social transformations is inseparable from the moments when workers recognized themselves as a collective force. Feudalism collapsed not because individual peasants rebelled, but because masses realized their shared oppression. Industrial capitalism was shaped not by the goodwill of owners, but by the organized struggles of workers who refused to be treated purely as instruments of profit. Every improvement in social conditions, work hours, safety standards, wages, rights, originated not in the benevolence of the ruling class but in the collective demands of those they exploited. What moves history forward is not abstract ideas or isolated acts of defiance, but the awakening of a class that sees itself clearly for the first time. When workers recognize that their labor produces all wealth yet grants them none of the power, when they understand that their struggles are mirrored in the lives of millions, when they grasp that their unity is the force capable of overturning existing structures, then the foundations of society begin to shift. History changes at that moment because the class that sustains the world finally understands its role in it. Unity is not sentiment, it is the material force capable of overturning the entire capitalist order. It is not a feeling of warmth, not a poetic ideal, not a moral appeal to kindness or cooperation. It is a concrete power rooted in the very conditions of production, a force that emerges from the collective position of workers in society. Capitalism depends on the labor of millions who do not own what they produce, who do not control the tools they use, and who do not determine the conditions under which they work. This dependence creates a structural vulnerability. As long as workers remain isolated, this vulnerability is invisible, masked by the apparent stability of markets, institutions, and industrial processes. But when workers unite, the hidden truth becomes clear. The system functions only through the coordinated effort of those it exploits, and when those workers act collectively, they possess a force capable of transforming the entire structure of society. Unity is not about emotional harmony. It is about shared material interests. A worker in one factory and a worker in another may have different lives, different cultures, different languages, yet both confront the same fundamental reality. They must sell their labor in order to survive, and the value they produce is appropriated by someone who contributes none of the labor that creates it. This shared position is the basis of their unity. It is rooted in the economic arrangement that shapes their existence, not in personal similarities or sentimental attachments. When workers understand this, unity becomes a material necessity rather than an idealistic aspiration. It is the recognition that their power lies not in individual strength, but in their collective role within the system of production. Capitalism cannot exist without labor, but labor can exist without capitalism. This is why unity becomes the decisive force. When workers recognize that they are the ones who keep the factories running, who maintain the transportation networks, who power the digital infrastructure, who distribute goods, who construct buildings, who tend to the sick, who educate the young, and who sustain every aspect of daily life, they realize that their combined action has the potential to reshape the world. The capitalist order appears powerful only because the workers who sustain it have not yet discovered the full measure of their collective strength. This discovery is not emotional, it is structural. It emerges from the material fact that labor is social, interdependent, and indispensable. The ruling class understands this better than many workers do. That is why it invests enormous effort in preventing unity. It encourages competition among workers, fosters divisions along lines of race, nationality, skill, gender, and status, and propagates the ideology of individualism. Workers are taught to believe that success is personal, that struggle is personal, that survival is personal. They are encouraged to see one another not as allies in a shared struggle, but as rivals in a narrow contest for limited opportunities. This fragmentation is not accidental. It is a strategy to prevent workers from recognizing the material basis of their power. For if they did, the foundations of the capitalist order would be shaken at their core. Unity becomes powerful precisely because it is grounded in material reality. It arises from the fact that workers share not merely grievances, but a collective position in the economic structure. They produce together, they suffer together, they depend on each other for the functioning of society, and therefore they possess a shared potential to transform society. When they unite, their strength is not symbolic, it is practical. It affects production, distribution, and the entire economic process. It interrupts the flow of capital. It compels the ruling class to respond. It forces changes that no individual effort could achieve. Every major transformation in social relations has emerged from the power of collective action. Not from sentiment, not from moral pleading, but from the material force generated when workers act together. This force is capable of reorganizing institutions, redefining rights, restructuring economic arrangements, and challenging the control that a minority holds over the labor of the majority. Unity is the point at which class consciousness becomes class power, where understanding turns into action, and where the latent force of the working class becomes visible. Unity is not an abstract dream. It is a material instrument forged from the shared conditions of life under capitalism. When workers grasp this truth, they no longer see unity as a gesture of goodwill, but as the very mechanism through which they can confront exploitation, reshape society, and determine their own destiny. In the end, everything returns to a single, undeniable truth. The working class holds in its hands the power that shapes the world, even if the system teaches them to doubt it. The capitalist order survives not because it is wise or just, but because workers have been conditioned to stand alone, to see their struggles as personal burdens, and to forget that every factory, every institution, every social structure exists only through their collective labor. The moment they recognize that their exploitation is shared, that their power lies not in isolated endurance but in unified action, the foundations of the present order begin to tremble. For unity is not a feeling but a material force, a revolutionary potential grounded in the very structure of society. When workers understand that they create all wealth, sustain all industry, and carry on their shoulders the entire functioning of modern life, they see that they are not powerless but indispensable. And once they rise together as a class clear in understanding, firm in purpose, united in struggle, the world that seemed immovable reveals itself to be nothing more than a system waiting to be transformed by the very people who make it possible.